Everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, New Data, Does Social Sharing Impact Organic Ranking and Cost Per Click? We are very excited to have everyone join us today. My name is Callie, and I'm just here to get things started, so I'm going to get some of the logistics out of the way really quickly so we can get straight to the fun with Larry and Steve. Following our presentation, you'll receive an email with today's recording and slides, so be on the lookout for that. If you don't catch everything during the webinar, that's totally fine. And then at the end, we'll have time for Q&A just a little bit, so don't be shy throughout the presentation. If you have any questions, definitely submit them in the question poll area, and we will get to as many as possible. So now I'd like to introduce our WordStream speaker today, Larry Kim. He's our founder here at WordStream, and we are so excited that he was able to join us today. So Larry, would you do the honor in introducing our guest speaker today?
Thanks, Callie. Yes, this is Larry, and I want to introduce my good friend Steve Rayson, the CEO and founder of BuzzSumo. BuzzSumo is a fantastic social media kind of a trending analysis tool for figuring out what is doing great on your social media and what isn't, and it's a great. We've done a couple webinars together over the past few years, and it's always a pleasure to do one of these with you, Steve. Welcome.
Great, thanks, Larry. No, it's really a pleasure and privilege to be here. And thank you so much for inviting me again, and very much looking forward to the webinar today. So welcome, everyone. I've got the task today of doing a sort of intro and scene setting, which I'll run through with you. But as Larry said, I'm from BuzzSumo. If you don't know BuzzSumo, we're really a data tool. We crawl data about content, and then we'll show you the most shared content and who's sharing it on a topic. But today is really not about BuzzSumo, so I won't spend too much time on that today. What I really want to do is set the scene. Larry's done some fantastic research, which he's going to share with you later in this session. So, and I'm really looking forward to it. I've seen some of it, and really interesting data. But what I've been doing is really looking at recent studies. So what some of the recent studies, including our own research, say about social sharing and its impact on click-through rates, on rankings, on views, and things like that. So I'm a bit of a data nerd, as those of you who've heard me talk before will know, and I'm really looking for other correlations between social sharing and things like click-through rates, and can we learn from them, really? So I'm just going to run through the bit of research that I've been doing. There's been lots of research, I'm sure lots of you know that, about the relationship between social sharing and Google rankings, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I thought I'd just cover off some of the research that's taken place. There's a really great post, the link is in the slides, which you'll get at the bottom of the slide there, from Brian Dean, who lists 205 different ranking factors that potentially go into where you appear on Google. Some of those are proven factors, some are speculation, but they include a range of things such as social shares and things like click-through rates. And I think click-through rates are more accepted. Social shares are very controversial in terms of potentially not being a factor. But I thought I'd show you some of the correlations that people have done by way of background. So this is a study that Searchmetrics did last year in 2015. So they looked at ranking correlations, and I've just picked out some of them. There are a lot more if you go to their site, but they particularly found a very strong correlation between click-through rate and ranking, and I think that makes sense to all of us. But interestingly, they still found reasonable correlations with social shares, and I should probably say that those of you who are not statisticians, I mean, the correlation, generally people use the Spearman coefficient correlation, which goes from -1 for a positive negative correlation to +1 for a sort of 100% positive correlation. So we can see the social shares here are between 2 and 3, so they're positive but not super strong. But interestingly, their correlations were stronger than time on site or even links, which is unusual because we expect links, and everyone I think accepts links to be a very strong correlating factor. So social shares clearly have some correlation, and this was also found by Moz. Moz did a study last year. They do a study each year. I just pulled out the social share correlations. And again, we can see they found similar things. Facebook and Google stronger, Twitter shares lower. So they found a correlation as well. But we have to be really cautious when it comes to the Google ranking. And Searchmetrics made this clear, Moz and everybody else makes this clear, so I thought I would just make it clear as well that there's a big difference between correlation and causation. So because something is correlated doesn't mean it causes it necessarily. It might indicate there's more interrogation and work that we need to do. And you can get very spurious correlations, so you have to be careful. There's a very fun site called Spurious Correlations, as it happens. And I just picked out one of them. They have loads and loads of these, but this one is, US spending on science correlates really closely with suicides by hanging. Clearly one doesn't cause the other, but they're correlated. So we just have to be cautious. A correlation really indicates something that we might want to explore further to see if there is causation. And this is the reason that the Google social shares, they don't take into account what Matt Cutts from Google says, and he says this quite strongly, is, okay, you might find a positive correlation, but that's not causation. And what he says is that sites that get lots of shares or lots of social engagement also tend to be sites that are good, and so they get other signals like links that do contribute to ranking. So what he's saying is it's just happenstance in a way, because they're a good site, so they get both shares and both links. So whilst we can see a positive correlation, not necessarily a causation. When it comes to traffic, we do know that social sharing causes traffic overall. Now there's questions about the impact on individual sites. This is a piece of research I'm going to come back to later. It was actually done by Columbia University, and their estimate from looking at a lot of content was that social media accounts for about 30% of all traffic to websites, which is actually higher than traffic from search engines, so quite significant. So we know that social sharing clearly has an impact. It clearly drives traffic. And this finding is not unusual, just so you know. Here's another piece of research. This is a little older now, from Shareaholic. They track 300,000 sites across the web. And across those 300,000 sites, they found that over a quarter of all traffic to those sites comes from social shares. So, or rather 25% from Facebook. You can see the others relatively low there. Pinterest driving a bit, Twitter and things relatively low. Facebook incredibly strong in terms of driving traffic to websites. So we do know that social shares clearly can drive traffic, and we can see that in the statistics. However, if we want to look a bit deeper, is there a relationship between social sharing and factors such as dwell time and click-through rates? And as I say, Larry's going to share some really interesting research that he's done after my session here. But I'm just looking at what other people have found. So I've gone away and I've done the research, and as I say, I'm really keen on data. So if you've got other research, do share it. I'm very keen to look at it. So I started by saying, is there a relationship? And I went through a lot of the academic research, and there's a great academic archive called HEL here, and I pulled out a study from Columbia University, and that looked at a data set of 2.8 million shares across 59,000 different URLs, and it was mainly looking at big news sites, so Fox, New York Times, CNN, etc. So just bear in mind these were news sites, but it looked at what was being shared on social, what was getting clicked through, and then how long people spent on the site. And we'll have a look at the results there. I've put the URL in here again if you want to check it out for yourselves. But what was quite interesting is they looked at the click-through rates and things, and they found that firstly, and I think this probably wouldn't surprise us, but 59% of all the shared URLs in social posts were never clicked. So almost 60% of them never clicked at all, which may not be surprising to us necessarily. What was more interesting, that second finding there, was that 90% of the clicks that did occur actually took place on posts that were shared at least 9 times. Basically, the more shares you got, the more likely you were to get click-throughs, and the higher the click-through rate. It's sort of obvious in a way, but nice to see the data. Basically, if you're only getting 4, 5, or relatively low levels of shares, you're less likely to get a higher click-through rate. So the click-through rate actually went up the more you got shares, and that's an interesting point that we're going to come back to. And it's something that's quite important to the research, I think. They also found, this is more of an aside, but they also found that people are much more willing to share an article than to read it. So they found there are definitely cases where articles got more shares than they got views. So they could see that people were sharing articles and not necessarily reading it. So there isn't much of a relationship between sharing and viewing necessarily. And I really like this. It's quite old now. I'm sure a number of you will have seen it. But it's a post by the Science Post saying the study shows 70% of Facebook users only read headlines before commenting. The article was shared 45,000 times. There were tons of comments on social media. There were loads of rants about people saying people should read articles before they comment on them. But when you look in detail at this post, you'll see that it's just full of Latin text. So only the first paragraph actually had English text in it. The rest was just Latin text. That didn't stop people sharing and commenting on this particular article just to prove their point, really. So that's a sort of a more fun example of showing that people are prepared to share without necessarily reading the post. In fact, the research by Chartbeat shows something which is counterintuitive. They actually found that the less time people spend reading an article, the more likely they are to share it, which you would think is counterintuitive. The more you read it, you like or the article, and you then share it. But actually they found that actually the less time people spent on an article, the more likely they were to share it. And I think this is the success of listicle posts and other scannable posts. Often people scan them and say, yeah, that's the sort of thing I want to share, and they share it. They don't necessarily spend a lot of time reading it before they share it. So interesting to find data which is sort of counterintuitive, that the less time we spend reading, the more likely we're actually likely to share something on social. So coming back to the research that Chartbeat were doing, which is behind that chart there, they also looked at dwell time, the time you spend on a page. So they looked at 2 billion visits, so quite a lot of data in their data set. What they found was, on average, people read about 50% of an article, so broadly 50%. And actually, they only really scrolled further if it contained photos. So articles with lots of photos and images, people scrolled down further, but on average about 50%. What was slightly worrying for all of us is that the majority of people spent less than 15 seconds actively on any page. So they're really coming in, skimming it, and going again quite quickly. So you've got a very short period of time to grab and engage your readers if 55% of them are clicking away before they've really read it. And as we suspect, 5% of readers don't scroll at all. They look at it and they leave without any interaction. For us today, what was interesting is they specifically looked at whether there was a correlation between the number of Twitter shares and people coming from Twitter and the amount of an article consumed. So if something was shared on social by your friends, did you read it more than you'd read another article? And they really found that wasn't the case. They found that there was really no correlation between where you came from and the number of Twitter shares something had. So it doesn't look as if something's got a lot of shares, even if it's been shared by your friends on Twitter, it doesn't look as if you'd actually spend more time reading the article than if you found it through another route. So we can't really see much relationship between social shares and the amount of time you spend reading an article. Looking at click-through rates, and as I say, Lara done a specific study for us to look at later. This was a study done by Outbrain. I'm sure a lot of you know Outbrain. They place content on a lot of the big major publications and smaller publications. So, if you like this, you might want to read this, or trending around the web, for example. And they did a study themselves looking at social shares and referrals from Facebook and click-through rates. And they found a small positive correlation between shares and click-through rates. They found a slightly higher correlation where the traffic came from Facebook and Facebook likes and shares. So it was similar to the rankings data, a small positive correlation, but not necessarily causation. So we are seeing some positive correlation between shares and click-through rates. What's also interesting is we did this study a year ago with Moz. We took 1 million posts at random, and we tried to see, was there a relationship between shares and links? And we genuinely expected to see a positive correlation. We expected to see if a post got lots of shares, it would get lots of links. But actually, when we looked at 1 million posts at random, we found there was no correlation at all. And we looked, as you can see here, at domain links, subdomain links, external links. You can see the correlation is effectively zero. We found no correlation between the number of shares and the number of links. And that surprised me and worried me a bit, because other studies had found high correlation. So we had to do a bit more delving to understand how did others find high correlations when we'd found a low correlation. And I think we did find why this was happening. When we started looking at really highly shared posts and highly shared sites, we started to find a much higher positive correlation. So here, there's our random sample with referring domains. It's got virtually zero correlation. But once we look at the New York Times or we look at the Guardian, we can start to see a much more positive correlation. And for posts on the New York Times and the Guardian that got really high levels of shares, it also got high levels of links. So basically what we were finding is that really highly shared posts had a much higher correlation of shares and links. So again, something's happening with those posts that are doing incredibly well on sites, as opposed to on average, where there was no correlation. And going back to that Columbia research, they said very specifically that the pattern of clicks from social favors a blockbuster model. It favors really high-performing content. And we can see this when we look at the distribution of shares across articles. So here I've taken 100,000 posts at random. On average, 50% of them had less than 8 shares. But you can see on the left-hand side there that most articles had less than 50 shares, that big blue block there. And you can see very few articles, have more than 800 shares or more than 1,000 shares. On social media, certain posts win, but they're really outliers, and there are very few of them, as we can see here going out to the right. And I was interested as to whether that also applied to those really big sites that we talked about, like your New York Times, etc. So I did another piece of research looking at the top 100 marketing and technology sites. So these were TechCrunch, these were Inc., where Larry writes, Entrepreneur, Moz, etc. So I just took the 100 top ones. And you can see the distribution of shares is very similar again. Actually, there's higher shares, but actually most articles get relatively low shares. So I looked at it further. So if we look at that 3,000 mark in the middle there, I've drawn a little red line for you on the 3,000 mark. I was interested to see, how many articles got more than 3,000 shares, because it's getting very thin at this point. And what we found was that only 4% of posts on those top 100 sites. So remember, these are the top 100. These are Incs, TechCrunches. Only 4% of those posts got more than 3,000 shares. So 96% of the posts, even on those big sites, were getting less than 3,000 shares. So when you see a post get 10,000 shares or 8,000 shares, and you see Larry's articles, and they're always getting huge numbers of shares, they're actually outliers. They really are the unicorns in posts. Even on those big sites, there are a lot of content achieving far less shares. But the interesting thing is those really high ones also are likely to achieve much higher links and clicks. So we're starting to get really strong correlations when it comes to those at that right-hand edge. So in terms of summarizing the research, we didn't find any correlation between shares and reading or shares and dwell time, but we do see positive correlations, obviously, between shares and traffic, shares and rankings, shares and click-through rates. Now, we're not saying this is causation, but we are seeing some positive correlations there. But I think more interestingly is we're seeing much higher correlations for blockbuster content. And I think it needs a lot more exploring, but I think these are the unicorns that win on everything. I think the content is so good, it actually gets links, it gets shares, it gets click-through rates, which at one level might be obvious, but it's quite interesting that that seems to be the case. It is not the case lower down. Whether you get 20 shares or 200 shares doesn't really affect those rates or those correlations, but if you get a lot, you get over 3,000, it seems to. And so there's something unique about those unicorns, that content that's performing really well. And we've identified some common elements of those blockbuster posts. So I'll just touch on these and then pass it over to Larry. But what are some of the common elements? And you may have seen this research before from us, but we looked at thousands and thousands of top performing posts, and we found they typically contained 3 or more of these elements. So an emotional element, a specific content element, so were you going to get images, facts, quotes, charts, etc. A topic element, some topics just work better than others, cats, dogs, babies, trending topics like Donald Trump, for example. Some formats work better than others. And good posts also had a promise element, and this worked both in the content but often in the headline as well. People would say 10 amusing images about Donald Trump, 10 shocking facts about babies, whatever it happens to be. There's a sort of style that people were using. But I think what was important also was the promise element and the format element. So list posted very well, promise elements like how to posted very well. And just to show you how well they did amongst that top content, of those top posts from those top 100 sites that I looked at, 30% of them with more than 3,000 shares were list posts. So a third of those articles were list posts, which is huge, really. And list posts beginning with 10 average more than list posts beginning with 5. And I just put an example there of those 5 Twitter tools, which got a lot of shares. That one on Social Media Examiner. But the other interesting thing about those top unicorn posts were they delivered value. So how-to posts, 15% of those top posts with more than 3,000 shares, so still a significant percentage, were actually how-to posts or ways to. So they were promising value to the reader. So we need to do more research about what really performs well, but it does seem that obviously list posts consistently perform well, posts that promise perform well, and if you combine at least 3 of those 5 elements that I outlined, then that seems to really help a content do very well, particularly on some of the larger sites. So I hope that's sort of interesting background in terms of some of the correlations that we've found so far. And now Larry's going to unveil some new research that he's been undertaking, so I'll pass it back to Larry.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Steve, for sharing your own data and curating all the other industry information on this topic. I want to take the story forward a little bit and kind of share some new insights that we've been working on here at WordStream regarding this topic matter. Let's see here. All right, guys. So I have a question for you. Have you ever seen this phenomenon before in your own website marketing? For example, Exhibit A. So this is a keyword search phrase for catchy email subject lines. So when you do a Google search for that, here at WordStream, we have this blog article that actually ranks for the #1 listing for that particular search query, and of course, it's a blockbuster post. It gets something like 500,000 views over the last couple months from organic search, and we're wondering like why the heck is it doing so well? And we try to figure out how is it ranking so strongly? And among the many different things that we find, one of the signals was that it happened to have a lot of shares. So in this case, 1,352 shares for like a WordStream blog post, where our average number of shares is much lower. It's closer to a couple hundred. All right. Here's another example. I call it Exhibit 2. So best free survey sites. And in this case, if you do the Google search for this keyword and related keywords, what you'll see is that WordStream is getting like not only the top spot, but also the what is that called? The universal answer box above the search results there. And so that's pretty big. It's generating like 250,000 visits from organic traffic over the past few months. And lo and behold, when we look at that piece of content, we see that it got over 1,000 shares as well. And just one more crazy example here. Develop presentation skills. Again, very high rankings, both in the answer box as well as the organic rankings there. And generating tons and tons of organic traffic for this page. And of course, we see this over and over again, where our top posts that are doing the best organically also get the most shares. So the question is like, what the heck? Why are we seeing this over and over again? And it was really bugging me because I was just reading all this research, and they're all saying like there's no connection or that there's correlations, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a strong connection or etc. Like various research. So I wanted to get to the bottom of this, and so here's what I found. And before we go into all the details of the research, just want to introduce myself a little bit. My name is Larry. I'm with a government organization known as the X-Files Department, where we look into unusual marketing activity and that is unexplained, and we try to get to the bottom of this using like math and data science. I'm absolutely obsessed with quality score and other Google algorithms. Originally from Winnipeg, a city in Canada, which is famous for being colder than Mars for half of the year. Live in Cambridge, where we started WordStream back in 2008, originally out of a bakery because of the free Wi-Fi and unlimited Diet Coke refills. Today, the company has over 10,000 customers and manages nearly $1 billion of ad spend for our customers worldwide. All right. Oh, I also have a 2-year-old kid named Julian, and you can follow him on Twitter using the hashtag PPCKid. That's us running the Boston Marathon earlier this year. All right, so back to our story here. Kind of summarizing what Steve just kind of set talked about how there's existing body of research showing, strong relationships between social shares, traffic, shares in organic rankings, shares and click-through rates. But the question was, like, what's really causing these relationships? Why aren't they stronger? Are we missing some certain variables? We're just looking for ways to explain the observed phenomenon, if you will. And so, the number one theory that SEOs always have is it's like, oh, Google must be counting the number of shares on social media and somehow factoring that into their algorithm. And Google has, time and time again said that emphatically that is not the case, and they're not doing that. And so, it's rare that they so unequivocally kind of renounce a certain theory like this. So I have to believe that this is probably the case here. Because like if they didn't want to admit something, they could just not comment on the matter. Do you see what I'm saying? So I'm going to take these guys Google at the word here that they're not using social signals directly in their search rankings, but the question then becomes, like, so if Google isn't directly looking at these social sharing signals in their rankings, what the heck is going on? Why do we keep seeing these patterns over and over again? And in order to get to the bottom of this, I wanted to first point out the difference between the absolute number of social shares versus a social engagement rate. Okay, so absolute number of social shares is that has to do with the total number of people or total number of times something was shared on the various different social networks like Facebook or Twitter, etc. And you just count them up, and those are those stat counters that BuzzSumo pulls numbers from, and that you see like in the blog posts in the various stat counters. That's the number of social shares. Social engagement rates, it's a slightly different metric. What that's saying is what percentage of the people who saw the update actually engaged with that post. So, for example, clicked on the post, or maybe expanded the image, or perhaps viewed the profile of the person who was sharing the post. And so it's a lot like click-through rate in pay-per-click marketing. So that's the social engagement rates. They're similar. Obviously, you would expect them to be related. Higher social engagement rates would likely, mean you're going to have a higher number of social shares, but they're not identical. So the main difference here is that the social engagement rates, it's divided, it's just the total number of unique people who've engaged with your post divided by the total number of people who saw your post. So the main reason why the social share count doesn't equal the engagement rates is because the number of shares, it's going to be proportional to other factors as well, such as if I pay to promote a post, then I can rack up more shares, or if I'm using other organic methods of promoting a post, then I can get more shares, and that's slightly different from the engagement rate. Okay, so that being kind of out of the way, we now know the difference between engagement rates and number of shares. I wanted to compare this notion of social engagement rates versus organic click-through rates. All right, so stay with me here. It's a little bit of math, but I know we can get through this. Basically, what I did was I went into Facebook Insights for an account here, and I've exported certain data from the Facebook Insights console, including engagement rates and of different pieces of content that were shared on Facebook. The second part of this study involved finding the organic click-through rates for those pieces of content that were shared on Facebook. And so the way that you do this is you just go into Google Webmaster Tools, into the Search Console, download your query data, including the clicks, impressions, and click-through rate and position for your organic queries, and download that. They provide you with 1,000 sample queries for you to download. So basically the idea was to look at this notion of relative organic click-through rate and compare it to the engagement rates on Facebook in terms of like what were the post engagement rates. And I think this is, as far as I know, this is the first time anyone's attempted this type of research. It's actually very, very difficult to do because this data isn't available publicly. You have to be the owner of your website account to log into your Facebook Insights account, into your Google Webmaster Tools to get this click-through rate data, because this is not available publicly. And so I think this is the first time anyone's ever done this. And basically, I found a very interesting possible some possible clues to figure out what's going on here. And so what I found was that so take, for example, a typical post on Facebook. The typical engagement rates for these posts might be 1 or 2%. But if you can increase that engagement rate to like 8, let's call it 8%, okay, which is roughly, I would call it 4 times higher than average engagement for like a Facebook post, then what we found was that that same piece of content that you shared on Facebook would also likely get a very, very high click-through rate on Google search. Now, we had to compute something called a relative search CTR, because obviously, if you're in the first position, you're going to have a higher click-through rate than if you're in the 10th position, right? So we have to account for those differences in expected click-through rates for the different positions. But once we backed out the expected click-through rate and compared the normalized click-through rate versus these engagement metrics, like a pattern started to emerge. Basically, the higher the post engagement, the higher your organic click-through rate. This pattern became just similar to what Steve was talking about before. This pattern was very, very strong with the outliers. So those posts that were having 6, 8, or 10% Facebook organic engagement rates of 6, 8, or 10%, those did remarkably well in organic search, having 200, 300, or 400% higher organic click-through rate than the expected click-through rate for their given organic position. So this is kind of interesting, and I think it kind of explains half of the story. The other thing that you need to know about click-through rates. First, let's just summarize that research here, because it is new, so basically, what we're saying here is that organic click-through rates and social engagement rates are there's a relationship here, and I would theorize that basically it's the same emotions that make people want to share things on social media. Those same emotions make people want to click on things like crazy on Google search. Also, we found that this relationship was particularly true for the unicorns, so the headlines that had unusually high engagement rates and click-through rates. So the other thing that you need to know is that the algorithms for organic search have been shifting over the last months or years. Basically, as Steve mentioned in some of these previous studies, Google appears to be looking into user engagement factors more and more in terms of their organic rankings, things like click-through rates, for example. And here we were able to do some research on this matter on those same keywords that I was just using in this exact same study. And basically what I can tell you is that the keywords that had a very, very high, unusually high unusually high click-through rates compared to what they were expected to get, were very, very likely to show up in the top 3 or 4 spots, and keywords that had lower or like less than average expected click-through rate were less likely to show up in those spots. Basically, for every 3 points increase or decrease in the expected click-through rate, you would on average increase or decrease 1 spot in the organic rankings. And so if you combine this whole thing, basically the old theory was basically saying, oh well, if you get lots and lots of shares, you're going to get lots and lots of you're going to get great organic rankings, and that was kind of the story that I was telling you earlier at this presentation when I was showing you the different pages. The new theory it goes something like this. So Google isn't, directly looking at the number of shares from Facebook or Twitter, but if you have a piece of content that has a very, very high number of shares, then it's very, very likely that you also have a very, very high social engagement rate for those posts. And we know that those high social engagement rates from this new research, that then translates to, generally speaking, above average organic click-through rates. And we know from this research also that above average organic click-through rates tends to lead to higher organic rankings. So I think that's kind of the theory here. I'm going to just stop right here and just ask Steve, like, any thoughts, anything to add, any comments or on this, what I'm talking about here?
Yeah, no, I mean, I would agree with what you're saying here. I think it's not direct, and Google are very clear it's not direct. But I think high social shares are clearly impacting on other things, such as you say, impacting on click-through rates, etc., which themselves can then impact on factors that do have an impact on ranking. So, no, I absolutely understand what you're saying here, and that makes sense to me, really, that they're not looking at social shares directly, but social shares, and I think particularly high levels of social shares, are having an impact on other factors which do impact on the organic rankings.
Cool. So let's just go back and look at those UFO sightings from earlier in the presentation. Remember that best free survey site thing? When I looked it up in Facebook, when we share this piece of content on Facebook, it gets a 7.4% engagement rate, and that's much higher than the average engagement rates for this particular page, which is, closer to 1 or 2%. So that's like, we're talking 3 or 4 times better than average. What about catchy email subject lines? When we share this piece of content on Facebook, it gets an 8.5% engagement rate. Again, 4 times better than average. And what about how to develop presentation skills? This thing, it's getting the 7.1% engagement rates on Facebook, which is much, much higher than the average engagement rate of 1 or 2%. So what I like about this theory is that it kind of fits the data that we have available. We know that Google is saying that they're not directly looking at the number of shares, but yet it offers a plausible explanation for why the things that get the most shares are generally doing so great in SEO. So the question then becomes was this just an academic exercise, or what does it really mean, and then what should we be doing about this as marketers in terms of our various tactics and strategies? So I think what it means is that the click-through rates matter a great deal. All right, so these unicorn level click-through rates, I'm talking about high, very, very high click-through rate content that has 2, 3, 4, or 5 times higher than expected click-through rates. These are the things that generate not only lots and lots of social shares, they also generate great organic rankings. But wait, there's actually more here. It's even more important. The higher click-through rates we're finding in our research not only generate more shares and better organic rankings, they also generate higher conversion rates. So the theory behind this is that if you can get people really, really excited about and worked up about buying, about clicking on whatever it is you're selling, they're more likely to want to buy the thing. So that enthusiasm carries through not only from the click, but also through to signing up as a lead or a purchase for your site, which is, I think, important for marketers. We also know, and this is fairly well known, that higher click-through rates will lead to higher quality scores in AdWords, but also on other paid per-click advertising platform, including Facebook advertising, including YouTube advertising, Google Display Network, Gmail ads, even Twitter ads. They all reward high click-through rates with higher quality scores. And of course, higher quality scores on these various paid advertising platforms results in higher impression shares. That means that those platforms will be more likely to want to show your ad versus competing ads. You also get rewarded with with huge discounts on the cost per click. So in AdWords, these high quality score keywords get dramatic discounts of up to 50% off the list price versus these really ridiculous 400% penalties if you're trying to advertise using junk ads and junk headlines. So guys, I think what I'm trying to say here is that these click-through rates, especially the outlier click-through rates, not just being a little bit better, but being 3 or 4 or 5 times better than average, these unicorn click-through rates, it's kind of important. And I think that if we could just just summarize some of the benefits of these unicorn click-through rates, we're saying it's going to make or break your social media in terms of getting lots and lots of shares. remember Steve was saying it's like a blockbuster kind of thing, like winner take all kind of thing. It's same thing. We're seeing this in organic search. The unicorn click-through rates get ridiculously great rankings. And then from the paid search and paid social perspective, these high click-through rate pieces of content or ads generate remarkable number of impressions at very, very low cost per click with very, very high click-through rates. So the connection between all these different variables hasn't historically been known, but I think smart marketers are starting to take notice and figure this out. So I wanted to help you out on your journey here by just offering 3 quick unicorn CTR hacks to make sure that your ads are super clicky and your social headlines are super clicky and your organic listings are super clicky. It's all the same idea here. My number 1 unicorn CTR hack has to do with auditioning more headlines. So basically, as Steve was saying, you need to leverage one of these powerful emotional triggers like laughter, fear, joy, awe, anger. This is interesting. Try to write your headline copy from the perspective of one of these 4 personas. So rather than having it come from the perspective of a company speaking to a customer, have it come from the angle of like a comedian or a feel-good friend or a hero or villain or a bearer of bad news. And then employ the title template, which is commonly employed by viral articles. This is actually research that Steve conducted in our last webinar, and he said, like, this is the formula for like a really clickbaity, headline, title tag or format, which would also work as a great ad headline from that, because like search ads and organic listings and Twitter tweets, they all more or less look the same. They're even the same number of characters, like 140 characters. So same idea. All right, so even if you have that template format and you're using these emotions and personas, the problem is that you're still not guaranteed to have a unicorn headline. And so the question is, like, how do we know for sure if the headline that we're writing is going to be like, 3 or 4 or 5 times better than average click-through rate? And so the idea here is to audition them. Okay, so it's like playing a lottery where the odds of winning are 1 in 10 if you're trying to get to the top 10%, all right? So the idea here is to try out 10 different headlines and see which one is the true unicorn, as opposed to just something that we thought was a unicorn but actually wasn't. Maybe it was like a triceratops or a narwhal or a hummingbird. Let's figure out how we can find the unicorn, and we're going to need a unicorn detector. So the idea here is you write up multiple headlines for the asset that you're looking to promote, either on paid channels or organic channels. So write up different headlines, and you have to choose different emotional hooks and different angles and different personas, and then using the format that Steve suggests. And then the idea here, I think this is interesting, is you can use AdWords to test these headlines. See, the worst thing that you should be doing is like, going to your organic content and changing the headline every 2 days or something. That's crazy, because then the search engines are going to be like, what the heck is going on with this page? No. What we're going to do is we're going to spend $50 or $100 to drive traffic to this page, but we're going to have different headlines, and we're going to have them run as AdWords ads driving traffic to that page, and we'll just see which ones seem to be resonating the best. Now, we're not looking for little changes. We're not looking for the one that has like 1.1% click-through rate versus 1.3% click-through rate, and we're saying, like, oh my God, there's the winner here. No. We're looking for these outliers, strong emotional hooks and persona usage that can get like 3, 4, or 5 times better than the average click-through rates. If you don't find them, just throw them all out and just try again. My second unicorn click-through rate hack has to do with advertising. So remember, the way that what's the purpose of advertising, guys? The purpose of advertising is to bias people. All right. So the theory here is that you promote inspirational and memorable content about your brand to the target market of people who are likely to consume this content. People who are going to then see that ad, either a Facebook ad or a Google Display Network ad, or a radio ad, any kind of advertising. They're going to not necessarily take action right away, but they'll become biased. So they'll remember what you had to say, or some of them will remember. And later, when the need arises to buy whatever product or services that you're actually selling, people will either do a branded search for your stuff, or they'll do an unbranded search for your products and services, but they'll be biased towards clicking and buying from you because people tend to go with the brands that they've heard of. And just in case you're not convinced, I did some analysis here of comparing the click-through rates for new versus repeat visitors across different industries like shopping and tourism and education. And what I can tell you is, like, the people who are have a stronger brand affinity with the company, like the repeat visitors, have ridiculously higher click-through rates, 2 or 3 times higher click-through rates than those who weren't familiar with the companies or were less familiar. And the same thing has to do with conversion rates. The conversion rates for the repeat visitors were substantially higher, 2 or 3 times higher than the new visitors across every possible industry. So how do we do this? Well, we're going to use the power of Facebook ads to target the types of people who maybe aren't yet searching for the products and solutions that we have, but might want to be interested in buying this kind of stuff in the future. And so this is kind of what I do. We target people who are using AdWords or inbound marketing or partner companies or topics of entrepreneurship. Or if you're a jeweler, perhaps you could target people who have anniversaries coming up, or who are recently engaged. That would be a great way to get people to be familiar with your brand before searching on stuff, so that they're more likely to click and favor your brand when they do search on it. Same idea with behavioral targeting. This has to do with going after people who exhibit certain purchasing behaviors, like frequent business travel, etc. My last unicorn hack today has to do with remarketing, and this merely just says to make sure that once they become familiar with your brand, that you'd be very relentless to make sure they never forget who you are. And the way that you do this is just make sure that you're hitting them up with remarketing ads on Facebook, so that they remember having visited you and never forget. The weird thing about remarketing is that the more you hound them down, the higher the click-through rate when they do decide, the higher the conversion rate when they finally do decide to, click on your ad and finish whatever it was you were hoping for them to do. So that's all the research I have for today. In summary, I think the really key takeaway here is the value of these high click-through rate unicorns. I'm not talking 5% higher than average click-through rate. I'm talking 300, 400, or 500% higher than average click-through rates. I mean, naturally, you would expect them to be more valuable, because that means you're getting more clicks from these headlines, for these assets, whether it's on social or organic search or paid search. But what people might not realize is just how much more valuable this stuff is in terms of getting the lion's share of the social shares, the lion's share of the organic clicks in terms of the high rankings, and the remarkable great performance on the paid platforms in terms of having very, very high impression share, very low cost per click, and great conversion rates. So just say no to donkey CTRs and use these tips to make sure that your click-through rates are always unicorns. Callie, that's all I had. Did you want to tell the audience about our special offers for today?
Yeah, thanks so much, both Larry and Steve. I really appreciate it. So today we have some special offers for our audience. First up, we have a one-on-one AdWords consultation on a free demo of WordStream. And then we also have a consultation and demo from BuzzSumo. So if you want to, learn more about Larry and Steve and what our companies do, then definitely sign up for those, and somebody will reach out to you rather quickly. And also, if you want to learn about both, that's an option too. We'd be happy to help you. So now I'm going to get to some questions. First up, I know a lot of people have asked if they're going to receive the recording of today's webinar, and you are, so don't worry if you missed anything. There's a lot of content covered in a short amount of time, so you'll get those in a little bit. And Steve, I know you have to jump off a little early. So thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problems at all. And I really enjoyed it. And I do apologize to people that I have to jump off shortly in a couple of minutes' time. But if you have any questions at all, just mail me. I'm just steve@buzzsumo.com. Or if you want me to jump on a webinar, take you through any of the data, I'd very happily do that. And if you've got other pieces of research I haven't mentioned, I'll be very keen to review them. So, yeah, no, happy to help with any questions that I can.
Great. Thanks, Steve. So the first question that I have coming in is, is LinkedIn not considered a social share channel? This wasn't really talked about a lot, so people were just wondering a little bit more about LinkedIn.
Okay, I can answer that from my side. I mean, we do look at shares from LinkedIn, both content published to Pulse and LinkedIn shares, and so it definitely is a valuable channel. But for specific industries, really, I think a lot of the B2B stuff is through LinkedIn. And when we did the analysis of what sort of emotions, what sort of words worked on the different networks, we found a big difference with LinkedIn. So posts with successful mistakes, habits, those sorts of words in the headlines tended to work better. In fact, even trends, industry trends, things like that worked well on LinkedIn. But we definitely look at LinkedIn as well as the others, although the really big driver for social shares and traffic tends to be Facebook on average, of course. But for some specific B2B topics, LinkedIn is still quite strong.
From a pay-per-click advertising perspective, LinkedIn doesn't have the quality score algorithm underpinning their paid social media advertising offering. So that means it's like flat rate pricing, like $6 a click or something like this. So even if you're promoting some piece of unicorn content that has like 20% engagement rate, you don't get any additional impression share, you don't get any discounts on the cost per click. So some of the benefits of the high click-through rates are actually negated on that platform. In fact, you would be, because it's flat rate cost per click pricing, you might be better off just running with a donkey that had like very, very specific, ad copy, like only click on this ad if you have like $2 million to spend on this thing, like something, some really, really kind of very qualifying language on your ad copy, trying to dissuade people from clicking on it, because when you do click on it, you'll get charged $6 or whatever, and there's no penalty for having low click-through rates.
Great. So we have some smaller businesses on the line today, and they're wondering, a little bit about when they get lower volume. So say they get 4 shares and 5 clicks on a social media post, and that's like a huge deal. So do these stats have the capacity to make any difference for, content marketers that don't work for major publications?
I think they do. I mean, we started as we're only a couple of years old at BuzzSumo, so we start small. For me, the couple of lessons are, firstly, if you're only getting 4 or 5 or 6 shares, I think you probably need a better amplification strategy. I think so many people spend so much time on the content but don't think about the amplification. So amplification can be paid, as Larry's talking about, or you can boost via Facebook, for example. But amplification also, who's going to share it, who's going to link to it? I think you have to be thinking about that before you write the post, because if you write it and you only get 4 shares, maybe very few people are seeing it. So I'd look then at your amplification strategy. I'd also look at maybe producing less content but higher value content. We've seen from these numbers that it's really, you want to get really good content that gets high shares. So personally, you'll see on the BuzzSumo blog, I write a blog post every 4 to 6 weeks. And a lot of people say, should you write more or less? For me, what works is it takes me that long to do a good piece of research with some good insights, and then I write it. And so, my posts typically now are getting about 3,000, but believe me, they started at about 50, 60, gradually worked up. But I just try to produce infrequent but high quality pieces. I find that works for me as a small business. But I mean, Larry may have different views, but for me, that's what works. But if you're only getting 4 or 5 shares, I think you need to think about what's the content you're writing, and particularly, do you have an amplification strategy before you even start writing it?
4 or 5 shares, I'm not going to lie, that's looks a little bit challenging. One thing I would just look at is your engagement rates. All right, so it's not just the number of shares that matter. It's also like, if 5 people saw the post and 5 people shared it, well, that's remarkable. Like, that's a very, very strong percentage. That would mean you have 100% of the people seeing this post actually sharing it. So, like, I would be looking at the engagement rates. Is it like a 1 or 2% engagement rate, which is like a donkey, or is it like 10 or 20% engagement, which is like approaching unicorn level? And if you do have high engagement rates, well then that just means that you just need to step on the gas with the promotion. If you have low engagement rates of 1 or 2%, then not much greatness will come out of promoting that content. You see what I'm saying? Because if it didn't work for a couple hundred people, it's not likely going to work. If you just add more people to that to see the post.
Great, thanks so much. All right, we're going to try to squeeze one more question really quickly. So Larry, what about things like Pinterest? How do you measure click-through rate and shares on that?
I have no idea, Steve. I don't even know about their ads. So.
Okay, I think Steve had to hop off to another webinar. Great, well thanks so much everybody. That concludes today's webinar. I'd like to thank Larry and Steve for your time. This was great content, really excited about it. And definitely encourage all of our attendees to reach out to Larry or Steve if you have any additional questions or want to discuss anything further. They're happy to help out. And again, the presentation and the slides will be shared later on today via email, so definitely be on the lookout for that. And hope to see you all